Most people picture divine blindness as a violent lightning strike that shatters eyes on the battlefield. The truth is different. What happened in Dothan in the 9th century before Christ required a perceptual confusion so deep that armed men followed, docile, the very enemy they had come to capture. This is the story you were never told about how a prophet blinded an entire army with a single prayer. Consider the geopolitical landscape of northern Israel around 840 before Christ. The kingdom of Aram, with its capital in Damascus, lived in intermittent war against the kingdom of Israel, with its capital in Samaria. Ben-Hadad, second of his name, commanded one of the most feared armies in the region, with war chariots pulled by trained horses, heavy infantry equipped with bronze shields, and Syrian archers renowned for their precision at 80 paces. Israel, under King Jehoram, son of Ahab, lived under the constant pressure of lightning raids, surprise attacks on border villages, stolen cattle, women taken, men slaughtered in wheat fields before the midday sun could burn off the morning dew. Put the scale of that threat into perspective. Damascus lay roughly 210 kilometers northeast of Samaria, a march of 4 to 6 days for an organized army. And the Arameans knew every ford on the Jordan River, every passage through the mountains of Gilead, every valley where a nighttime ambush could destroy a caravan before sunrise. But something had begun to go wrong in the Syrian operations. Every time Ben-Hadad gathered his generals inside the royal tent, laid out the plan, fixed the exact point of the ambush, chose the night, calculated the number of men, something would pass through those leather walls and reach Samaria ahead of the army. When the Arameans arrived at the designated location, Israel's troops were already positioned in defensive formation. The ambushes became reverse ambushes. The hunters became the hunted. The biblical text in 2 Kings 6, from verse 8 through verse 12, records this pattern with administrative precision. Ben-Hadad convened a war council and accused his officers of treason. The generals, bewildered, swore absolute loyalty. It was then that one of them, evidently well informed about the affairs of Israel, said what no one wanted to hear. In Israel there was a prophet. His name was Elisha, disciple and spiritual heir of Elijah. And this prophet, according to the officer, could know even the words that the king of Aram whispered in his own bedchamber, behind closed doors, with armed sentries standing 3 paces from the royal bed. Grasp the gravity of that accusation. This was not an ordinary spy, not a paid informant. This was someone who, without moving from Israel, could hear what was said inside the citadel of Damascus as though seated beside the throne. For Ben-Hadad, that could only mean one thing: the prophet had to be eliminated, and quickly. Syrian military intelligence located Elisha in the city of Dothan, a small walled town roughly 18 kilometers north of Samaria, along the caravan road connecting Galilee to the south. Ben-Hadad did what any rational commander would do when facing an asymmetric threat. He did not send a squad, he sent an overwhelming force. Horses, chariots, a great army. Follow the movement of that military column, departing Damascus southward, descending the royal road, crossing Galilee, skirting Mount Gilboa, arriving at the rolling hills that surrounded Dothan. A march of 4 days, perhaps 5, with soldiers in ordered formation, spears pointed skyward, shields hanging from the flanks of the horses, the war chariots producing a metallic clatter audible 3 kilometers away on a calm night. It was the same scale of force that years later the Assyrian annals would describe when recording the Syrian coalition with 1,200 chariots and 20,000 soldiers at the Battle of Karkar in 853 before Christ. This was not a police operation. It was an annihilation operation. Calculate the psychological impact of watching that column approach. For the inhabitants of Dothan, ordinary people living off herding and farming, witnessing from atop the walls a foreign army completely encircling their city during the night, was the most terrifying sight imaginable. There was no Israelite army nearby, no military garrison, only a prophet, a young servant named Gehazi, and several hundred unarmed residents with women, children, and the elderly sheltered in stone houses with packed mud rooftops. The encirclement closed at dawn. Elisha's servant, probably a disciple from the school of prophets, young, trained in scripture and prayer, but without any military experience, woke early and climbed to the rooftop terrace. The biblical text describes what he saw in 2 Kings 6, verse 15. An army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. He ran downstairs in a panic and cried out to his master a phrase that carried the weight of a death sentence. "Alas, my lord, what shall we do?" Elisha's reply, recorded in verse 16, is one of the most subversive sentences in the Hebrew scriptures. "Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Notice the paradox. The servant saw hundreds, perhaps thousands of armed men. Elisha saw something else entirely, and there he offered the first prayer recorded in this episode. A prayer that asked not for strength, not for escape, not for an army. It asked for sight. "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And the servant saw. The text describes in 2 Kings 6, verse 17, that the mountain surrounding Elisha was full of horses and chariots of fire, a parallel reality that had always been there, but that the ordinary human eye could not perceive. The first prayer did not change the scene. It changed the servant's perception. It was an adjustment of vision, not an alteration of the landscape. And here begins the point that most popular accounts ignore. The second prayer, the one that blinded the army, uses in Hebrew an extremely specific word that is nearly unique across the entire Old Testament. It is not the common word for blindness, which would be ivaron. It is sanvarim, a word that appears in only 2 places in all of Hebrew scripture. Here, in 2 Kings 6, verse 18, and in Genesis 19, verse 11, in the episode where the angels strike with blindness the men of Sodom who were trying to force their way into Lot's house. Examine what that means philologically. Sanvarim does not describe total loss of sight. It describes a dazzlement, a visual confusion, an inability to recognize what one is seeing. The men could see but could not comprehend what they were seeing. They recognized shapes but not identities. They saw faces but could not connect them to enemies. It was functional blindness, not optical blindness. That is why they could walk. And here is the detail that changes the entire reading of the episode. Elisha descends from the walls of Dothan, passes through the city gate, walks toward the enemy army unarmed, alone, and says to the Syrian soldiers a phrase that sounds like an incantation and functions like an order. "This is not the way, and this is not the city. Follow me, and I will bring you to the man you seek." Think about the scene. One man, a staff in his hand, standing before hundreds of armed soldiers, and they obey. Not because the horses were killed, not because the chariots were burned, not because the generals were persuaded. They obey because their perception had been reconfigured by a force that had no name on the Syrian battlefield and no entry in the military manuals of Damascus. And Elisha begins to march. The distance between Dothan and Samaria is approximately 18 kilometers in a straight line, descending through the hills toward the south. For an army equipped with shields, spears, short swords, and full combat gear, the march would take between 5 and 6 hours at a steady pace. 5 to 6 hours during which men trained to kill walked, obedient, behind their target. Each infantryman carrying between 15 and 22 kilograms of equipment, with heat beating down on leather armor and dust rising from sandaled feet. Put into perspective what those soldiers felt during that march. Every step was a confusion. Every bend in the road felt familiar and foreign at the same time. The sun, high overhead, seemed to be the same sun as in Dothan, but the landscape kept shifting. Their feet knew they were descending. Their eyes could not map the route. Anyone who has never experienced an intense sensory confusion, severe vertigo, acute intoxication, or the sudden waking from a deep dream cannot fully comprehend the psychological dimension of that state sustained across half a day's journey. Silence. The biblical text describes no conversations during the march, no shouts, no protests, no orders from the Syrian commanders, only the sound of hooves, of footsteps, of chariots grinding across the packed earth of the Sumerian hills, a silent procession of 1,000, perhaps 1,500 armed men being led into the heart of enemy territory by a single prophet, the equivalent, in combat mass, of twice the full garrison of a frontier fortress of the period. And not one of them, at any moment, realized he was being led directly into the trap. And between the feet of that prophet and the capital of Israel, the march continued. Consider the scene in Samaria. The city was one of the most formidable fortresses in the north, built by Omri on a steep hill, rising roughly 120 meters above the valley floor. It featured double limestone walls, watchtowers every 25 meters, gates reinforced with bronze, and a permanent military garrison. Archaeological excavations conducted in the 20th century revealed cyclopean foundations of blocks up to 2 meters in length, cut from local quarries and fitted without mortar. King Jehoram was there, the generals were there, and no one expected to see, descending the road from Dothan, an entire Syrian army walking within range of their arrows. When Elisha crossed the gates of Samaria with the army behind him, he offered the third and final prayer recorded in this episode. Lord, open the eyes of these men that they may see. And they saw. Consider the impact of that moment. Syrian soldiers, trained, professional, commanded, suddenly realizing that they were not in Dothan. They were inside the walls of Samaria, surrounded by the Israelite garrison, trapped within the very city they had sworn to destroy. The chariots they had brought to crush a village were now stopped in narrow streets with no room to maneuver. The horses, squeezed between stone buildings, neighed in panic. The spears, useless in urban close combat against defenders who held every topographical advantage. It was the most complete military humiliation recorded in the history of the Israel-Aram conflict. Follow what came next. King Jehoram, seeing the opportunity fallen from the sky, turned to Elisha and made the request any eastern king would make. "Shall I strike them, my father? Shall I strike them?" The language of the text in 2 Kings 6, verse 21, shows the king's urgency. He repeats it twice. The military instinct screamed to annihilate. Elisha said no. The prophet's reply in verse 22 is one of the most counterintuitive declarations in the scriptures of war. You shall not strike them. Would you strike those you have taken captive with your own sword and bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. Grasp the magnitude of that command. Elisha was not proposing generic mercy. He was proposing a complete reversal of the logic of war in the ancient Near East. In the military world of the 9th century before Christ, prisoners had 3 possible fates: slavery, triumphal display and public execution, or ritual mutilation as a warning to others. Aramean soldiers captured in Samaria would normally have had their eyes gouged out, their thumbs severed, or been impaled on the walls as a message to Damascus. The Assyrian reliefs of that period show exactly those scenes, carved in stone, displayed in royal palaces. Elisha proposed a banquet. The text describes in 2 Kings 6, verse 23, that Jehoram prepared a great provision. The Hebrew word used implies an abundant, festive, deliberately generous meal. This was not stale bread and rationed water. It was a full table. The same soldiers who had marched from Damascus to kill ate inside Samaria as though they were guests of the royal palace. In silence, certainly. In humiliation, certainly. But in absolute safety. And then they left. back to Damascus, back to Ben-Hadad, back to tell a story that no Syrian officer could rationally explain in a war council. The result, recorded at the end of verse 23, is one of the most understated and remarkable observations in the entire text. And the bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel, no more. There was no formal peace treaty, no exchange of ambassadors, no dynastic marriage, only the silence of Israel's northern borders for months, perhaps years, until other geopolitical tensions reopened the conflict at far greater intensity, with prolonged sieges and famine inside the walls. But notice the dimension of the human cost of this story, which is rarely mentioned in popular readings. Think about Elisha's servant. He woke at dawn and saw death surrounding the house where he slept. He lived in seconds the terror that many soldiers experience only once across decades of combat. For a young man of probably 18 to 20 years, trained in scripture but not in warfare, that morning was a traumatic shock whose mark accompanied every subsequent decision he made. The biblical text does not record this servant's name in this particular episode, but rabbinic tradition and certain Christological readings identify him as Gehazi, the disciple who later, in 2 Kings 5, would be struck with leprosy as a consequence of greed. Consider the irony. He saw the army of God, but later chose the path of silver and the garments of Naaman. Think about the Syrian soldiers. Not Ben-Hadad, distant in Damascus, the men of flesh. They were conscripted rural workers, mercenaries from nomadic tribes, young men from Syrian cities trained from the age of 14 for military service. 1,500 men, perhaps 2,000, marched alive from Dothan to Samaria without understanding what was happening to their own eyes. That trauma has no precise name in the modern psychiatric vocabulary, but it approaches what we would today call acute depersonalization. The sensation of not recognizing one's own body, one's own surroundings, one's own reality. Imagine living that for 6 hours in a column with armed men, with growing thirst, with heat bearing down on leather armor, with dust coating the sweat on their eyelids. And then, upon recovering their sight, they discovered they were surrounded, trapped, with no way out, and that their immediate fate would be death. Every heartbeat during that moment of recognition before Elisha's decision marked those men for the rest of their lives. They returned to Damascus, but they did not return whole. Something in them stayed in Samaria forever. And think about Ben-Hadad, the powerful king, master of hundreds of war chariots, commander of an army that terrorized the entire Levant, receiving back inside his own capital, alive and fed, soldiers he had sent to kill. Every word of the accounts those men brought back was a knife to the royal pride. Every detail was a reminder of powerlessness. The biblical text does not say whether Ben-Hadad attempted to respond publicly. It says only that he stopped making raids. Diplomatic silence, military silence, a silence that costs more than 1,000 defeats in open battle. Modern archaeologists confirm the general historical context of this period through discoveries such as the Tel Dan Stele, found in 1993, which confirms the existence of the Davidic dynasty and the military tensions between Aram and Israel in the 9th century before Christ. Assyrian inscriptions, especially the annals of Shalmaneser III, record Ben-Hadad as leader of a coalition that faced the Assyrian army at the Battle of Karkar in 853 before Christ, with approximately 1,200 war chariots and 20,000 Syrian soldiers. Those numbers reveal the scale of the military power that Elisha challenged with 3 prayers. No comparable army was neutralized anywhere in the entire record of the ancient Near East without the use of weapons, prolonged sieges, famine, or epidemic. None. And the case of Dothan remains a documented anomaly, debated by scholars of both prophetic and historical traditions for more than 2,700 years. Put into final perspective what this story reveals. Elisha had no army, no weapons, no military defense. He had a young servant, a small city, and 3 phrases directed toward the sky. The first phrase changed the vision of one frightened man. The second phrase dismantled the perception of hundreds of soldiers. The third phrase reopened eyes at the precise moment when discovering the truth was most devastating. 3 phrases, 3 requests. No spectacle, no visible thunder, no fire descending from the clouds, only prayer. And the factual result, recorded in sacred text and contextualized in parallel historical sources, was the greatest military reversal without combat recorded in the ancient Near East. An entire army, trained, equipped, and commanded, was neutralized, led in silence for 18 kilometers into the heart of enemy territory, and returned alive after an unexpected banquet. The story of Dothan is not the story of divine punishment. It is the story of a narrative reversal in which every expected element of a military campaign was inverted. The hunter became the hunted. The victim became the host. The weapon became an abundant table. The siege became hospitality. The prophet became the commander. The commander became a freed prisoner. And what those people in Dothan on that particular dawn did not know they were building was a narrative precedent that has crossed 3 millennia of reading, debate, and meditation. It crossed through Second Temple Judaism. It crossed through the early church fathers. It crossed through the Islamic tradition that recognizes Elisha as a prophet under the name Al-Yasa. It crossed the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, modern textual criticism, and it continues to cross every contemporary reading that approaches the text, seeking to understand exactly how an unarmed man neutralized an entire army with just 3 phrases directed toward the sky. The word Sanvarim still appears in Hebrew concordances in only 2 places across the entire Bible, Dothan and Sodom. 2 sieges, 2 attempts at violence, 2 interventions narrated with the same philological precision, and both with the same result. Perceptual confusion as a mechanism of protection, and what those Syrian troops walked through across the hills of Samaria without recognizing the road, without identifying the destination, without understanding what they were doing, continues to be read by more than 2 billion people across the world in nearly every written language, as one of the most singular episodes in all of the religious literature of humanity. 3 phrases, 1 march, 1 banquet, and the silence of borders that became more eloquent than any military victory ever won with blood.